Solara perched in the shadows, her cloaking suit perfectly blending with the craggy outcropping of rock behind her. She observed the lone human male below, who stood unarmed on the barren plateau. Her orders had been clear: terminate the target before he shared his findings with anyone else. Yet something felt off. His calm, composed demeanor unsettled her. He should have been afraid, panicking at the knowledge of his imminent death. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, as though unaware of her presence. Solara had carried out countless missions before, but this moment made her hesitate. Her comm implant crackled in her ear. "Solara, confirm status," said a cold, mechanical voice. She inhaled deeply. "Target acquired. Preparing to engage." The words felt heavy on her tongue. For a moment, she did nothing. The human, a scientist according to her briefing, looked up at the sky, his face illuminated by a pale blue star. The light highlighted streaks of gray in his dark hair and lines at the corners of his eyes. He was older than she'd expected, older than most of her assignments. She lowered her weapon just slightly. "Who are you?" The question escaped her lips before she realized it. The man turned, startled but not terrified. He squinted, as if trying to spot her through the shimmer of her cloaking field. "My name is Robert Kane," he said, his voice steady. "And you are?" Solara didn't answer. She stepped forward, her cloaking suit disengaging so he could see her clearly. His eyes widened, but still he did not run. "Do you know why I'm here, Robert Kane?" He tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "I can guess. I assume my research upset someone in your chain of command." "Research?" she repeated, her tone flat. "You mean the information you planned to deliver to the interstellar Concord?" "Yes," he replied simply. "It's something they need to know." She studied him, trying to find any trace of deception. He looked tired but calm, as if he'd already accepted his fate. "I've read your file. You work for the Federation. I'm here to prevent you from doing something that might threaten my people." "I don't think my work is a threat," Robert said. "If anything, it's meant to prevent threats, to prevent misunderstandings." Solara frowned. "Explain." Robert's shoulders relaxed slightly. "You've been taught that humans are dangerous, that we can't be trusted, that we'll take any opportunity to gain power over others. Isn't that why you're here? To eliminate me before I can prove otherwise?" She didn't answer, but she didn't raise her weapon again either. His words unsettled her more than his steady gaze. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then why do you risk so much to deliver this information? Why not just disappear?" He gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because I believe in what I'm doing. I'm willing to put my life on the line for it. I think you'll understand that." Solara felt an uncomfortable stir in her chest. Belief, loyalty, these were concepts she understood, but not in this way. She had been trained to obey orders, to serve without question. Yet here was this human, standing before her unarmed, offering no resistance, and still defying every expectation she had of his kind. She tightened her grip on her weapon, though she didn't aim it at him. "I have my orders. They don't include debating morality." "Maybe they should," Robert said softly. "You're not just a machine, are you? You're capable of choice." Solara's jaw clenched. "I choose to follow my mission." "And what if your mission is wrong?" he asked. "What if killing me won't solve the problem it's supposed to?" The air between them grew tense. Solara's finger hovered near the trigger. This should have been simple. End him, move on, report success. But the longer she stood there, the more difficult it became. Something about the way he looked at her, without fear, without hatred, gnawed at the rigid walls of her training. Robert stepped forward cautiously. "If you were just another soldier, we wouldn't be talking right now. You wouldn't care what I have to say. But you do care, don't you?" "I don't," she snapped. "I'm only giving you a chance to tell me what's so important about your research before I finish my job." He didn't back down. "Then listen. If I'm wrong, if what I've found truly threatens your people, then do what you came here to do. But if I'm right, you might realize your mission isn't as simple as you were told." Solara's mind raced. She had never been given room to doubt before. Her orders were her purpose. Yet here she was, standing in front of a human who spoke not with anger or fear, but with an almost maddening calm. She found herself lowering the weapon inch by inch, her thoughts tangling into something she didn't recognize. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. Chapter 2. A Moment of Mercy. Robert winced as the restraints bit into his wrists. Solara had him pinned to the rock face, her weapon holstered but her posture tense. She hadn't killed him. Not yet. That, at least, gave him a glimmer of possibility. "What are you planning to do with me?" he asked, his voice calm despite the ache in his shoulders. "Interrogate you," Solara said flatly. Her tone was cold, almost mechanical, but her eyes flicked across his face like she was studying something unfamiliar. "I want to know what's worth risking everything for." "You could just ask nicely," Robert said, managing a faint smile. "I tell you, no need for all this rough treatment." Her brows furrowed, though she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step back, her fingers twitching near her belt. "I'm not here to negotiate." "You said you'd interrogate me," Robert said. "Fine. Go ahead. Ask whatever you need to know. I'll tell you." Solara's hands hovered over the controls on her gauntlet. "You just give me the information?" "I don't have anything to hide," he said. "And honestly, you could have killed me earlier. You didn't. That tells me you're at least open to hearing me out." Solara's jaw tightened. "This isn't a negotiation," she repeated. "I know," he said. "It's a conversation, a chance to explain. You don't have to like me, but I think you might at least understand where I'm coming from." She stood silently for a moment, then crouched in front of him. "Fine. Talk." Robert adjusted his position against the rock. "Okay. Let's start with the basics. My research is about communication. I've been trying to find better ways for humans and other species to understand each other. We've had too many close calls, misunderstandings that nearly turned into conflicts. What I found is a method, a protocol, that could prevent those misunderstandings from happening in the first place." "That doesn't explain why my superiors sent me to eliminate you," Solara said, her voice sharp. "If your work is as harmless as you claim, why would they see it as a threat?" "That's what I don't understand," Robert said. "Maybe it's because this new method levels the playing field. It means no side can exploit miscommunication to gain an upper hand. Everyone has to operate with the same information, the same understanding. Some people on both sides prefer things the way they are. They like the ambiguity. They can twist words, play games." Solara's gaze narrowed. "So you think someone is trying to protect that advantage?" "Exactly," he said. "And I'm guessing the people who sent you were told I'm trying to manipulate things in humanity's favor. I'm not. I want this to benefit everyone, your people included." She leaned back, still crouched but less tense than before. "You don't strike me as a typical human," she said quietly. "Maybe that's why I'm out here, trying to make a difference," Robert said. "You seem different too. Most agents in your position wouldn't have hesitated." Solara's expression hardened. "I'm not like most agents." "Clearly," Robert said. "And that's why we're talking instead of fighting." Her eyes flicked toward his wrists, still bound. "You assume I won't just finish my mission as planned." "I think you're weighing your options," he said. "And I'm betting that the more we talk, the less sense my elimination will make to you." Solara stood abruptly and began pacing. "You're awfully confident for someone in your position." "Not confident," he said. "Just hopeful." She stopped, turning to face him. "Hopeful that I'll let you live? Hopeful that you'll see there's another way to resolve this," Robert said. "And if you don't, well, I guess that's the end of my story. But I think you're curious enough to keep listening. And as long as you listen, there's a chance you'll see the truth." Solara folded her arms, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at her lips. "You talk too much." "I'm a scientist," he said. "It's kind of our thing." For a moment, the tension between them eased. Solara walked back toward him, crouched again, and looked him directly in the eyes. "If I let you talk, you'd better have something worthwhile to say." Otherwise, I'll finish what I was sent here to do. I'll take my chances, Robert said. Solara shook her head, but she stayed where she was, listening as Robert began to outline his research in earnest. Chapter 3. An Unlikely Partnership. The small, cramped cabin on the unregistered freighter was far from luxurious, but it was at least secure. Solara watched as Robert worked at the table, his fingers tapping away on a portable terminal. She had removed his restraints hours ago. If he had any thought of running, he hadn't shown it. Instead, he had thrown himself into whatever calculations or notes he was scribbling, seemingly forgetting her presence entirely. "Do you ever take a break?" she finally asked, her voice cutting through the steady clacking of keys. Robert looked up, startled. "What?" "I asked if you ever take a break," she said, leaning against the wall. Her arms were crossed, and though her face betrayed little, there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You've been hunched over that thing for hours." He smiled faintly. "When you're on borrowed time, you tend to work faster. You assume I won't kill you." She let the words hang in the air. When he didn't respond, she stepped closer. "You're that confident? I think you'd have done it by now if you were going to," Robert said calmly, sitting back in his chair. "Besides, you seem more interested in my work than you let on." "I'm interested in why you're still alive," Solara replied. "No one's given me a good answer yet." Robert sighed and leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "I told you before, I'm not a threat. My research isn't about power or control. It's about finding ways for different civilizations to understand each other better, to avoid misunderstandings." "That's a lofty goal," Solara said, her tone skeptical. "Lofty doesn't mean impossible," he said. "But it's not just about communication methods. It's about trust. And that's something you can't program into a machine or force into someone's mind." Solara raised an eyebrow. "You're saying we just need to hold hands and sing songs?" "Not exactly," he said with a dry chuckle. "I'm saying it takes effort, time, willingness to see the other side as more than just a potential enemy." She regarded him in silence for a moment. "And you think humans and—" she hesitated. "My kind are capable of that?" "I think it's worth trying," Robert said, "because the alternative isn't sustainable." Solara tilted her head, studying him. "You talk like a politician." "I'm a scientist," he said, "and right now, I'm just someone trying to find a better way." She shifted her weight, her gaze lingering on him. "You keep saying this is about understanding, about building trust. But you know as well as I do that trust doesn't happen overnight. And some of us," she paused, "some of us aren't exactly predisposed to openness." Robert leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That's why I'm here, why I'm doing this. If I can show even a small step forward, it might inspire others to take that same step." "You think you can change entire civilizations with a few papers and a lot of words?" "It's not just about the papers," he said. "It's about actions, about proving that trust can exist. You start small and you build." Solara was quiet for a long time, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound between them. Finally, she pushed off the wall and sat across from him at the table. "If I don't believe you, I could take you back to my superiors. Let them decide what to do with you." "You could," Robert agreed, meeting her gaze. "But I don't think you want to." She narrowed her eyes. "You're assuming a lot." "No," he said softly. "I'm just saying you're still here. You haven't turned me in yet. That tells me you're at least willing to listen." Solara frowned but didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at his terminal. "What's all this?" "Data," Robert said, turning the screen toward her. "Communications patterns, cultural cues, shared linguistic markers. It's the foundation of the method I've been working on." She scanned the display, her expression unreadable. "And you think this will work?" "I do," he said simply. Solara leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed again. "I'm not convinced." "Then let me prove it," Robert said. "We're in neutral space now. No one's coming after us, at least not yet. Give me a chance to show you what I'm trying to accomplish." If I fail, I won't stop you from taking me in. But if I succeed, she tilted her head, considering him. If you succeed, then what? Then maybe we both walk away from this with something worthwhile, Robert said. Solara's lips twitched in what might have been the hint of a smile. You really do like to talk. He grinned. And you're still here listening. She shook her head, but her posture was a little more relaxed. Fine. Show me what you've got. But don't think for a second that I'm letting my guard down. I wouldn't expect anything less, Robert said. Let's get to work. Chapter 4, Cultural Confessions. The freighter drifted through the void, its engines on idle. Inside the cramped galley, Robert and Solara sat across from each other at the narrow table, a small spread of alien and human rations between them. The dim lighting and hum of the ship's systems created an oddly intimate atmosphere. Solara picked up one of the human ration packets, turning it over in her hands. So, this is what you eat out there? Doesn't look very appealing. Robert smirked. You'd be surprised. Some of these taste pretty good. Others, well, let's just say you wouldn't want to know what's in them. She arched an eyebrow. I already suspect your species has questionable tastes. I've seen your art. That's fair, he admitted with a chuckle. We do have our share of creative choices. I'm guessing you have some strong opinions about human culture? Strong opinions might be an understatement, Solara said dryly. When you're raised to see another species as a potential threat, it's hard to appreciate their quirks. Robert leaned back, folding his arms. Let me guess. Loud, unpredictable, and too quick to stick their noses where they don't belong? More or less, she said. But you also have this strange tenacity. I don't understand it. You act like you're fragile, but then you survive situations that should have wiped you out. Sounds like we're full of contradictions, Robert said. But I'm curious. What about your people? I don't know much beyond the military side of things. There's got to be more to your culture than strict orders and precision strikes. Solara's expression grew thoughtful. She picked at one of the alien rations, breaking it into smaller pieces. It's not easy to explain. Our society values efficiency. Every individual is trained from a young age to contribute to the greater whole. Everything we do is geared toward stability and survival. That means little room for personal indulgences. So no time for art or music? He asked, his tone genuinely curious. Not in the way you'd think, she replied. We have a form of communal expression, but it's structured. Every sound, every motion serves a purpose. It's not about personal emotion. It's about maintaining harmony within the group. That sounds different, Robert said, choosing his words carefully. Do you ever feel like you're missing something? Solara's eyes flicked to his, a sharp look that softened almost instantly. What do you mean? I mean, if everything is about the collective, what happens to the individual? Don't you ever wonder what it's like to just be yourself? To make decisions because you want to, not because it's your duty. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the small window that showed the endless expanse of space. I never thought about it much. It wasn't an option. But now it is, Robert said gently. Out here, there's no command structure breathing down your neck. No one telling you what you're allowed to feel or think. What's that like for you? Solara set down the ration packet, her hands still. Unsettling, but also, I don't know, there's a kind of freedom in it. Not that I know what to do with it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I think you're doing just fine. You're asking questions, figuring things out. That's more than some people do their entire lives. She let out a soft huff of amusement. If you say so, but I don't understand how your kind deals with so much uncertainty. It's like you thrive on it. We don't always deal with it well, Robert said. But I guess that's part of what makes us who we are. We take risks, sometimes stupid ones, but those risks can lead to incredible discoveries. Solara tilted her head. And incredible failures. True, he admitted. But the failures don't stop us. They just make us try harder. Maybe that's what surprises other species about humans. We're stubborn. She gave a faint smile, the first he'd seen that seemed genuine. That might be an understatement. Robert picked up a piece of alien ration and nibbled on it, wincing at the taste. So, what about you? You must have something you're passionate about. Even if it wasn't encouraged back home, there's got to be something that makes you feel alive. Solara leaned back, her fingers tapping the edge of the table. I was trained for one purpose. Even after leaving my handlers, it's hard to think beyond that. I suppose I enjoyed tactical simulations, strategy games, figuring out the best way to solve a problem. That's a start, Robert said. What kind of simulations? Combat scenarios, mostly, she said. But some involved diplomacy, convincing a rival faction to stand down, negotiating alliances. I always thought those were more interesting than the straightforward battles. Robert smiled. That makes sense. You're a problem solver. Solara shrugged, though there was a hint of pride in her expression. Perhaps. Well, Robert said, finishing the last of his ration, I think that's something worth exploring. Who knows? Maybe you'll end up a better diplomat than me. Unlikely, she said, but her tone was lighter, almost playful. They sat in silence for a moment, the awkward tension that had lingered since their first encounter now replaced by a tentative camaraderie. Solara seemed more at ease, and Robert felt a small surge of satisfaction. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but at least now they had a foundation, however fragile, to build on. Chapter 5, Touch of Underst. The wall with her arms crossed, watching him work. Are you always this patient? She asked after a long silence. Robert didn't look up. Patience is part of the job. At least it used to be. Not exactly a strong trait among humans, Solara remarked. There was no malice in her tone, only curiosity. Robert chuckled. You'd be surprised. Scientists have to be patient. Experiments don't always go the way you want them to. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. What happens when they fail? You learn from it and try again, he said, typing another string of code into the system. The key is not giving up. Sometimes you have to adjust your methods or rethink your approach, but giving up isn't an option. Solara was quiet for a moment. You make it sound easy. It's not, Robert said, glancing over at her. But that's why it's worth doing. Solara pushed off the wall and stepped closer to him. That's the second time you've said that. Said what? That it's worth doing, she replied. You talk about this work like it's more than just a project. Like it's personal. Robert paused, leaning back in his chair. It is personal, in a way. I'm not just trying to solve a puzzle. I'm trying to make things better for people. Not just humans. Everyone. She seemed to consider this, her gaze dropping to the console. And you think you can do that with what? Algorithms? Communication protocols? They're a start, Robert said. They're a way to bridge the gap. The rest comes down to understanding each other. That takes time and effort, and trust, Solara interrupted. Which is the part that's missing? Robert nodded. Exactly. Trust doesn't just happen. You have to build it, bit by bit. She leaned against the console, looking down at the screen. And you think people, our people, will just start trusting each other because of a few tools? I think it's a step, Robert said. Not the solution, but a step in the right direction. Solara's gaze remained fixed on the console. You really believe that? I do, he said simply. Her hand moved slightly, brushing against the edge of the console where his rested. The touch was brief, barely noticeable, but it caused Robert to glance up at her. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before, curiosity mixed with something softer. Do you trust me? She asked quietly. Robert hesitated, then nodded. I do. She seemed surprised by his answer. Why? Because you haven't turned me in, he said. You had every chance to end this, but you didn't. And because you're still here listening. Solara straightened, her arms falling to her sides. Listening doesn't mean agreeing. No, Robert said. But it means you're open to the idea. That's a start. She took a step back, as if retreating from the weight of his words. This trust of yours, It's not something I'm used to. Neither am I, Robert admitted. But I think it's worth trying. Solara's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. You say that a lot. Well, I mean it. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. We'll see. Turning, she walked out of the room, leaving Robert alone with the soft glow of the console. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were making progress, not just with the translation algorithms but with something more important. Chapter 6. Learning Compassion. The air in the control room felt heavy as the small ship floated in the relative safety of a debris field. Solara and Robert sat at opposite sides of the room, the tension between them finally softened by days of uneasy camaraderie. The ship's sensors occasionally chirped, detecting faint energy readings from far-off vessels, but otherwise, the place was eerily still. Robert turned away from the flickering display screen, rubbing his temples. We can't keep hiding out here. The comm system's barely holding together, and if something breaks, we'll lose our connection to the database. Don't you think I know that? Solara snapped. She leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tightly. Do you think I enjoy floating in the middle of nowhere with a human who can't shut up about trust and understanding? He raised an eyebrow. Then why haven't you left? She hesitated, her gaze darting away. Because this isn't over yet. I need to see if what you're saying is true, if it's even possible. That's progress, Robert said, allowing himself a small smile. You don't have to admit it, but you're starting to believe. Solara's jaw tightened. Don't push your luck, human. He nodded, backing off for the moment. All right, let's focus on what we need. We're running low on supplies. The nearest station is too risky, but I spotted some old mining platforms in the records. One of them might still have salvageable materials. Mining platforms? Those places have been abandoned for decades, Solara said. You really think we'll find anything useful? Worth a shot, Robert replied. Besides, it's not like we have better options. She stared at him for a moment, then sighed. Fine, we'll check them out. But I'm not risking my life for a handful of spare parts. Fair enough, he said. But if we don't at least try, we'll end up stranded here. As they prepared to leave, Solara stood at the edge of the cockpit, staring out into the star-speckled void. Robert approached cautiously, his voice quieter than usual. You okay? She didn't answer at first. Her fingers brushed against the frame of the viewport, tracing a faint crack that ran through the glass. I don't understand you, she said finally. Join the club, he said lightly. I've spent my whole life not understanding why people do what they do, but I think that's part of the challenge. Solara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You've been trying to convince me that we can bridge the gap between our species. That we can actually work together. But what happens if you're wrong? If we're too different? Then we keep trying, Robert said simply, because the alternative is giving up. And I don't see much point in that. Her shoulders dropped slightly. You make it sound so simple. It's not, he admitted. But that's what makes it worthwhile. They exchanged a long look, and for once, Solara didn't try to argue. Instead, she turned back to the viewport. Let's find that mining platform. Robert nodded, adjusting the ship's course. As they approached the coordinates, the faint outline of a derelict station came into view. Its once gleaming hull was tarnished and pockmarked, but it still held promise. Looks like no one's been here in a while, Robert said, scanning the readings. That could work in our favor. Solara was already strapping on her gear. If it's abandoned, it might still have some of the materials we need. Together, they ventured into the station, moving cautiously through dark, rusting corridors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of old metal. They worked in tandem, Solara clearing debris and checking for structural weaknesses, Robert carefully removing functional components from the machinery. As they searched, Solara paused in front of a sealed hatch. Hold on, she said, placing a hand on the control panel. I think there's something still operational behind here. Robert joined her, glancing at the faded markings on the hatch. If it's a supply cache, we might hit the jackpot. I'll try to override the lock, Solara said, her fingers dancing over the controls. The panel sparked, and with a groan, the hatch slid open. Inside was a storage room, long forgotten but still intact. Stacks of sealed containers lined the walls, and a faint glow came from an emergency power unit in the corner. Looks like we got lucky, Robert said, stepping inside. Solara followed, her hand resting briefly on the doorway. She watched as Robert opened one of the containers, revealing neatly packed components. These should keep the comm system running, he said, holding up a power relay. And we might even have enough to repair the navigation array. Solara walked over to another container, opening it cautiously. Inside were spare parts that would fit their aging ship's drive system. This will work, she said, her voice quieter. As they worked side by side, sorting through the supplies, the tension that had defined their relationship began to ease. There were no arguments, no pointed jabs, just a shared goal and a quiet understanding. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a step closer. Chapter 7, The First Kiss. The freighter's engines hummed steadily as it coasted toward a distant nebula. Inside the small cabin, Robert worked on recalibrating the comm system. He crouched next to the open console, wires spilling out like tangled vines. Solara sat on a nearby bunk, her legs crossed and a faint look of amusement on her face. "You always talk to the equipment?" she asked, watching as he muttered under his breath. Robert looked up, startled, then smirked. "Sometimes. Helps me think. Or maybe I just don't like the silence." Solara shook her head. "Strange habit." "Maybe," he said, tightening one last connection. The console sparked, then came back to life with a faint hum. "There. That should hold it." He stood, brushing dust from his hands, and turned to face her. "You know, I'm surprised you've stayed this long." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Solara replied evenly. "That's not true," Robert said, crossing his arms. "You could have left me on that mining platform. Could have flown off and reported back to your people." Solara hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe I'm curious." "Curious about what?" he pressed, leaning against the wall. "About you," she admitted after a moment. "You're not what I expected." Robert raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect? A threat? A self-serving opportunist? Not someone who cares?" He chuckled softly. "Not all humans are what you've been taught to think." "That's becoming clear," she said. Her tone was thoughtful, almost reluctant. "You're different, and you've made me question things I never thought I'd question." "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Robert asked. He moved closer, his curiosity matching hers. Solara looked at him, her gaze steady. "I'm not used to it, but maybe it is." There was a long pause. The air between them felt charged, but not with tension. It was something new, something neither of them seemed ready to define. Finally, Solara spoke again. "Humans. Always so quick to—" "What's the word?" "Connect," Robert offered. Her lips twitched. "Connect. That's it." He smiled, his voice gentle. "Is that such a bad thing?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down, as if trying to find the right words. When she finally looked back up, her expression had softened. "No, I suppose it's not." For a moment, they stood there, silence wrapping around them. Robert took a slow step closer. Solara didn't move away. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "You don't," she replied. Her voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. "It's just new." "New isn't bad," Robert said. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing hers. The touch was light, hesitant, but Solara didn't pull back. Instead, her fingers shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the gesture. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Solara's gaze wasn't guarded. Robert felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. A cautious hope that this connection, however fragile, might be real. He took another step closer, his hand still lightly resting against hers. Solara's expression didn't change, but there was a faint shift in her posture. a softening of her shoulders, a small tilt of her head. "Solara," he said quietly. "Yes?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you trust me?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched his, as if looking for something that would confirm what she was feeling. Then, without a word, she leaned in just slightly, enough for their faces to be close enough that he could feel her breath. And then it happened. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, a brief moment of contact that sent a spark through both of them. When they pulled back, Solara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite place. "What now?" she asked. Robert smiled. "Now we figure it out." Chapter 8. A New Path. The ship hovered in the quiet orbit of an unclaimed planet, its battered hull a testament to the harrowing journey it had endured. Inside, Robert worked at the main console, fine-tuning the ship's navigation system. The steady tapping of keys filled the cabin as he studied the charts. Solara stood nearby, watching him in silence. "So," she said, breaking the stillness, "what's the plan now?" Robert didn't look up, his attention fixed on the screen. "We find somewhere neutral, a station that doesn't ask too many questions. From there, we can start putting the pieces together." Solara folded her arms. "And then what? Just hand over your research and hope someone listens?" "No," Robert said, his voice steady. "I don't plan on giving it away. We're going to present it carefully, show them why it's in everyone's best interest." "And what if no one cares?" Solara asked. There was no hostility in her tone, just curiosity. "Then we find someone who does," Robert replied. "I didn't come this far just to quit." Solara studied him for a moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "You're more stubborn than I thought." He finally looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I've been called worse." She smirked and shook her head. "I'll bet you have." Robert leaned back in his chair, stretching. "So what about you? You're not exactly tied to any orders anymore. What do you want to do?" Solara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long my path was set. I followed commands. I didn't question them. Now I'm not sure what comes next." "Well, you have options now," Robert said. "You could stay and help me finish what we started." "And then what?" she asked, meeting his eyes. "You go back to your world, I go back to mine, and we pretend this never happened?" Robert's expression grew serious. "I don't think we can pretend, Solara. Too much has changed. For both of us." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You really believe that?" "I do," he said. "And I think you believe it too." Solara didn't respond right away. She turned and paced across the small cabin, her steps slow and deliberate. "I still don't understand humans," she said finally. "You're too unpredictable." "That's part of the charm," Robert said with a faint grin. "Keeps things interesting." She stopped and looked at him again. "Interesting isn't always good." "No," he agreed. "But it's never boring." Solara shook her head, though there was a trace of a smile on her lips. "You're impossible. And yet here you are," Robert said, standing up. "Still here, still listening, still wondering." "Don't push it," she warned, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. He took a step closer, his voice softening. "We've come this far together. Whatever happens next, we don't have to face it alone." Solara's gaze flicked toward the viewport, where the pale blue of the planet's atmosphere glowed faintly. "You really think there's a chance to make this work?" "I think there's always a chance," Robert said. "But it depends on what we do next." She turned back to him, her arms uncrossing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's not just about convincing others," he said. "It's about how we move forward, what kind of example we set." Solara raised an eyebrow. "You sound awfully sure of yourself." "I'm not," he admitted. "But I am sure of one thing. I don't want to go back to the way things were. Not for me and not for you." Her expression softened slightly, and for a moment, they stood in silence. Then, with a quiet exhale, Solara nodded. "Fine. We'll do this your way. Robert smiled. I knew you'd come around. Don't get too comfortable, she said, her voice carrying a hint of humor. I'm not doing this because I trust your instincts. I just don't want to spend the rest of my days drifting in this rust bucket. Fair enough, he said. Let's find that neutral station, and we'll figure out the rest from there. Solara glanced at him one last time before turning toward the cockpit. Then let's get moving. Robert watched her for a moment, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. They had a long road ahead, but at least now they were facing it together.